Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. The residents of Lido, Italy, dim their lights and prepare for a quiet evening. The near-constant breeze off the sea has settled, and the night is still for once. The din of tourists shuffling to and fro is finally fading, and the shouts of children grow distant as they are called to bed. Hours ago, the fishermen hauled in their catch and came home, gathered around dinner tables, and are now dozing in their chairs. Then, they hear it. Quiet at first, just a faint ringing somewhere out there in the dark. A bell tolling in the distance. Distinctive, persistent, growing a little louder with each chime, carried on the calm night air. Soft still, but unmistakable. They have heard this bell before. It's not the local church. There's no mass tonight. They know where the sound is coming from. Further away. From the old bell tower on Poveglia Island. The forbidden place. The island of death. They all know this is impossible. The bell on the church tower in Poveglia has been removed for over 200 years. And yet their ears recognize it immediately. Everyone can hear it. The ghostly tolling continuing into the dark. There are places in the world where the ghosts of history never seem to rest. Poveglia Island, off the eastern coast of Italy, is one of them, and it is the subject of today's episode. The small island served two terrible purposes: a plague quarantine station and a psychiatric hospital. Both functions meant that people sent to Poveglia faced profound suffering, living out their final days forgotten by society, cut off from everything and everyone they knew. No one knows how many people passed through this place of fever dreams and torment. Today, the island is closed to the public, so we'll take an imaginary trip there, moving through its history of death and abandonment, and into the many paranormal encounters and ghostly sightings reported across its grounds. But before we get to that, whether you're wandering among the limestone buildings of Kingston, the historic streets of Ottawa, or the moonlit lanes of Toronto, our storytellers are ready and waiting to introduce you to the spirits that may still linger in the shadows. If you're the type who prefers to leave the stories behind and get more involved, join us for our Alone in the Dark paranormal investigations at Cumberland Village in Ottawa or the village of Black Creek in Toronto. It's an intimate, hands-on experience where we leave the lanterns behind to see who or what emerges after the lights go out. Now, we know many of you are already mapping out your spring and summer travel plans, and we'd love to be a part of your adventures. Most of our tour dates for the upcoming season are now live and available for booking. Whether it's a family road trip or a weekend getaway, there is no better way to see a city than through its ghost stories. Head over to hauntedwalk.com to secure your spot. And because you're friends of the show, use the promo code HauntedTalks at checkout to save 15% off most tickets. That's hauntedwalk.com, code HauntedTalks. We'll see you in the shadows and give you some stories to take home. Poveglia Island is strategically located in the Venetian Lagoon, just offshore from Lido, Italy, which sits across a narrow waterway from Venice. Close to one of history's great maritime cities, the island occupied a key position for ships entering the lagoon from the south. Poveglia actually consists of 3 smaller islands, arranged in a fan-like shape, each separated by narrow man-made canals. Like much of the region, the island is flat and barely above sea level, leaving the ground soggy and vulnerable to flooding in extreme weather. Today, the island is covered in lush foliage, a carpet of trees and shrubs with birds fluttering in the branches. But for much of its history, Poveglia was stark and grim, devoid of life and covered in darkness. The island began as a small farming settlement, likely first established around 400 to 500 CE. The soil wasn't ideal for crops, but the location was perfect for fishermen heading out to the open water. Its strategic position was recognized by the Romans, who established dedicated governance of the tiny island. Unfortunately, invaders recognized it too, and Poveglia was frequently targeted by raiders bound for Venice. Through it all, the island's 12th century bell tower remained its most prominent feature. In 1379, the island was abandoned, its small community permanently relocated. For centuries, it sat largely forgotten. The military installed defensive fortifications in the 17th century in preparation for future conflicts, but Poveglia was never called into active service. Then, in 1776, everything changed. The island was transferred to Venice's Department of Public Health and transformed into a checkpoint for ships entering and exiting the city. They were known as lazarettos in Italian, common quarantine stations at all major ports. By then, Venice was a global shipping hub, with goods and travelers arriving daily from across the world. But foreign ports brought foreign diseases, and the city's dense population left it dangerously vulnerable to outbreaks. Venice has had a long and brutal history with illness. Waves of disease swept through the city repeatedly, often made worse by its watery geography and crowded waterways. Venetian officials were determined to keep sickness from reaching the city's doorstep. The checkpoint at Poveglia was a perfect solution, far enough from Venice to keep deadly illnesses offshore, but close enough to remain firmly under the city's control. The checkpoint functioned as expected for nearly a decade, with no serious outbreaks recorded. A dedicated quarantine hospital was eventually built on the island, and it managed to contain the worst of what arrived. But 1793 marked a turning point in the history of Venice. A ship carrying a passenger infected with plague arrived at Poveglia Island. Contrary to popular belief, the bubonic plague still prowled through Europe well into the 18th century. And, as with every outbreak before it, once it arrived, it was nearly impossible to contain. The disease crossed from island to city, and the people in Venice began to fall ill. The quarantine station undoubtedly slowed the spread, but for anyone housed on the island itself, exposure was almost certain. Although officials knew the plague was present on Poveglia, they didn't stop other ships from arriving or departing. Everyone on the island was potentially exposed, and before long, being sent to Poveglia had become a death sentence for those forced to remain quarantined there. The first outbreak eventually subsided, but a second followed in 1799. It was around this time that Poveglia earned a new and fitting nickname, the Island of Death. As plague fears grew, Poveglia became a place where people were sent and never returned from. For most, it was a one-way journey. The plague was so deadly and so difficult to survive unless caught early that these plague hospitals were effectively a death sentence for the majority of those admitted. The island's isolation made it ideal for containing infectious diseases, but that same isolation left the dying completely alone, stripped of comfort, far from home and the ones they loved. Poveglia functioned as a quarantine and plague hospital for decades, until the mid-19th century, when the last major outbreaks of plague in Europe were finally extinguished. In that time, spanning just over half a century, no one knows exactly how many people were sent to the island or quarantined there. The number of deaths is estimated between 100,000 and 160,000, and that figure doesn't include the few who managed to survive. The sheer number of dead created an overwhelming problem for officials on the small island. Where do you put that many corpses? Records are incomplete and accounts differ, but the plague dead were typically disposed of in one of two ways: mass burial pits or burning in large pyres. Either way, the scale is almost impossible to comprehend. At least 100,000 bodies on one small island over the course of only a few decades. Despite the absence of official records, there is material evidence that many victims were buried in plague pits on the island. Remnants of bones and human remains have been found on Poveglia, and marshy conditions of the Venetian Lagoon are remarkably effective at preserving organic matter. Some believe those same conditions may account for the island's unusual lush greenery. But the sheer volume and frequency of death meant the island could not accommodate everyone in the ground. Many victims were likely burned in the island's crematoriums, and during especially severe outbreaks, corpses were shipped off the island and burned elsewhere. A persistent legend holds that nearly half of Poveglia's soil is actually ash from the victims' charred remains. Impossible to prove or disprove. None of the graves were marked, no names were recorded, the bodies of plague victims were unceremoniously destroyed, their identities erased, and in some cases, that destruction came before death itself, in desperate attempts to stop the disease from spreading further. Due to the contagiousness of the plague, most of those tasked with disposing of bodies were either plague victims themselves or survivors who had developed some immunity. To prevent the spread to healthy people, workers on the island were quarantined there for long stretches of time. Those lucky enough to retain their strength and survive faced a particular kind of torment. Isolated on an island of death, responsible for the endless disposal of corpses, with no certainty of ever leaving. The plague is among the most gruesome ways a person can die. On Poveglia, the death played out thousands upon thousands of times, in close quarters, with no relief and no escape. The suffering here was not brief. It accumulated, layer upon layer, for decades. The island's landmarks were also transformed over time. In 1806, Napoleon's army destroyed the ancient church, leaving only its 12th century bell tower standing. The bell was removed and the tower was turned into a lighthouse. While it is no longer used as a lighthouse, the tower still has the equipment for it, a permanent reminder that it ceased being a place of worship long ago. The island sat largely abandoned for about 75 years, while Venetian authorities contemplated what to do with it. Stories about its dark past had already taken root, and so had the fear. Local fishermen refused to approach the island, making wide detours whenever they passed. Superstitions ran deep enough to stall any serious rebuilding efforts. In 1922, the Department of Public Health finally settled on a new purpose for the abandoned island: a psychiatric hospital. It was not an improvement. Health officials of the era held deeply backward views on mental health, and many patients were treated no differently than the plague victims who had come before them. People were confined for any number of reasons, often simply because they failed to meet the expectations of society. They were sent out to live their final days with minimal care, isolated, and forgotten. The hospital also conducted medical research and experiments on its patients, most of it dehumanizing by any standard. Poveglia had found a new generation of suffering. During its time as a psychiatric hospital, the island gained its most famous legend that endures to this day. Although the historical details of this tale are scant and no actual recording of this event exists, the story has been repeated so often, it likely has some basis in fact. As the tale goes, sometime in the 1930s, a doctor with a gruesome reputation was working at the hospital. He was known for performing painful and unnecessary lobotomies on his patients, and was rumored to take pleasure in their pain. When patients complained, he tormented them further. He operated above the law, and health officials did nothing to stop him. Out of sight was out of mind. But at some point during his tenure, the doctor began hearing voices and seeing apparitions on his rounds. At first, he dismissed them. But as the visions grew more frequent, the whispers more persistent, until they became a cacophony that drowned out the screams of his other patients. They followed him ceaselessly into every room during every waking hour, he could no longer sleep. He could not escape. In a final act of desperation, he climbed to the top of the old church tower and threw himself off. The story branches here, depending on who is telling it. Some say he survived the fall, but continued to be tormented by the voices until he died from his wounds a few days later. Others say he vanished into a mysterious fog and his body was never found. Still others claim his remains were bricked up inside the bell tower. The details different, but the shape of the story remains the same. The man who had tormented so many had been claimed, in the end, by the spirits of those he wronged. Some believe the paranormal activity on Poveglia ultimately drove the hospital to close. The more practical explanation is the high cost of maintaining aging buildings on an isolated island. The complex was briefly repurposed as an old age home, but that too shut down, again citing maintenance costs. The final residents of Poveglia left in the 1960s. Since then, the island has sat empty, sealed off from the public, and visited by almost no one. Since the permanent residents left, nature has slowly taken over the abandoned buildings. Many of the former quarantine station structures are long gone, and even parts of the psychiatric hospital have since been demolished. But the iconic church tower, where the doctor leapt to his death, and the absent bell is still heard tolling, is visible above the trees now wrapping the crumbling stone structures. It rises above the rest of the island and can be seen from the water in all directions, a solitary landmark over an abandoned place. The lush foliage has taken over most of the island, and birds have gradually returned. A defensive rampart is still there, standing as a barrier to keep the living out, or to keep the spirits in. When the island closed, it was effectively sealed off from the public. Visits were banned, and all marine infrastructure demolished to discourage unwanted arrivals. Not that the island was ever easy to stumble upon accidentally. It is, after all, an island. Local fishermen and boaters continue to give it a wide berth and have for generations. Some ship captains, caught in storms, reportedly prefer to ride out the rough water rather than risk washing up on its shores. Tourists regularly try to bribe their way onto the island, offering captains generous sums of money for a simple drop-off. The answer is almost always no. The island is cursed, and no amount of money will convince a superstitious sailor to moor nearby. Special permission to visit is rarely granted, and almost never to outsiders. A privileged few, film crews, historians, and a handful of paranormal investigators have managed to secure access. But in Venice, one of the most visited cities in the world, nearly everyone understands the same thing. Poveglia Island is forbidden. Those who do pass by sometimes see something along its deserted waterline. It is common practice to turn away as you pass, to spare yourself the possibility of catching a glimpse of one of the tortured spirits said to still inhabit the island. But sometimes, a sound draws the eye before you can look away. It's described as a pitiful wailing, the sound of someone deep in mourning. Others say it resembles the cry of a child lamenting the loss of her mother. And a few who have heard it have caught a glimpse of its source: a little girl wandering the water's edge, dressed in a white shift. She circles the island endlessly, searching for something or someone she never finds. No one knows her name. The locals have taken to calling her Maria. Given the island's history, most believe she is a plague victim, lost and unburied, walking an endless loop in search of a family she will never reach. It is not only plague victims who roam the island. Recent paranormal investigations have apparently uncovered evidence that former patients of the psychiatric hospital have also remained behind. One of the most frequently reported presences is a former patient, likely from the hospital era, who still haunts the hallways in his wheelchair. The locals call him Pietro. By most accounts, Pietro sounds like a residual haunting, a spirit repeating the patterns of his former life, unaware of the living world around him. His presence has been described as heavy and deeply unsettling. No one is quite sure of his intent or whether he has any at all. But the sound of a squeaking wheelchair moving through an empty hallway tends to settle the question of whether you want to stay and find out. There have been a few attempts to redevelop the island, to transform it into something the living might actually want to inhabit. Parks, hotels, and even a university campus has been proposed over the years. None of them have materialized. The most notable attempt came in the 1960s when a family toured the island with plans to develop it as a private vacation home. They decided to spend a night there to get a feel for the property. They left the following morning without explanation and informed the sales agent they were no longer interested. Their daughter was taken directly to hospital, where she was treated for severe wounds to her face. The family never spoke publicly about what happened. They were pursued by Italian journalists for years and refused every inquiry, demanding their name be removed from any record of the potential sale. The island has never been sold. It has never been developed. It remains exactly as it was left. There is, however, a more recent development worth noting. A local initiative is currently underway to transform Poveglia into a public park for Venice residents, a quiet retreat from the city's relentless tourist traffic. The proposal leans into the island's natural beauty, with modest amenities and open green space overlooking the lagoon. Plans were submitted in 2025, but news on the project has since gone quiet. Whether this attempt will succeed where all the others have failed remains to be seen. Although the island is officially closed to the public, the few people who have visited in recent years are paranormal investigators. Some with official permission, others who found their own way. Neither group has left disappointed. Footage shows team members terrified by the extent and level of activity. Since the place is rarely accessed, many believe the spirits that linger may be more eager to interact. On the other hand, many of the paranormal entities encountered during these investigations seem intent on driving people away. Their incredibly aggressive behavior takes many by surprise. Information about the island's true dark history and paranormal entities is still scarce, but each new investigation seems to reveal more. We expect a place that has witnessed so much death and suffering to carry a heavy paranormal presence. The island was not only a site of prolonged torment, it is also the final resting place of hundreds of thousands of people, all of them anonymous, all of them forgotten. The suffering endured here by people of every age over the course of more than a century is almost impossible to fully absorb. That weight lingers. People feel it the moment they arrive. Maybe that's the real haunting of Poveglia. Not just stories of ghosts, but the sense that so many people suffered here, and so few were properly remembered. So what should become of Poveglia now? A memorial? A park? A ruin left to rot in the wilderness? No one seems fully sure. But the island's most enduring answer may already be the one carried across the lagoon on certain nights. A bell that was removed centuries ago, still ringing in the night. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. For information on any of our ghost tours or paranormal adventures, please visit us at hauntedwalk.com. If you are enjoying the show, be sure you follow, rate, and review us wherever you listen. On social media, we'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode, and Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.